All right, so hello and welcome to the Master of Liberal Arts Anniversary Series brought to you by the Master of Liberal Arts Program and the Johns Hopkins University Office of Advanced Academic Programs. Tonight's event features Dr. Tristan Cabello discussing critical race theory, why you should care. My name is Peter Huggins and I'm the event producer. Please note, as I just mentioned, the first part of today's event will be recorded and uploaded to the AAP YouTube channel under the Master of Arts playlist. During the program, if you have any questions, Master of Liberal Arts playlist. During the program, if you have any questions, please feel free to use the chat. We'll be taking questions, in person later on. With that, I'm going to turn the program over to our moderator, Dr. Laura DeSisto, who is the program director and senior lecturer for the Master of Liberal Arts program.
Thank you, Peter, and good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening for the final event of our 60th anniversary series. Certainly not the final event for the MLA program, but it has been a really interesting year in which we've offered a range of different opportunities for the MLA student community and greater alumni community to come together and share in the history of the MLA program, the long-lasting benefits of the MLA program among alumni. And then we also had fun with a book and film club, and we did mini seminars. And now finally, we're going to bring our anniversary and our colloquium, not to be forgotten, this past Saturday. And then we'll bring the event to a close with tonight's discussion. So thank you for taking the time out of your very busy lives to join us this evening. Tonight's talk will be given by my colleague, Associate Director of the MLA program, Dr. Tristan Cabello. And as Peter already mentioned, he has a presentation that he'll provide at the beginning. And then we're setting aside plenty of time for question and answer and discussion. And that portion of the presentation will not be of our session, I should say, will not be recorded. During the presentation, if you want to submit a question while the ideas are fresh in your mind, please use the Q&A, and that should send it to us as the hosts of tonight's discussion. We'll still save it till the end of the presentation, but at least then they'll be organized, at least in terms of the order in which the different topics and issues were raised. Then once we open things up, you may use either the Q&A or the chat for the rest of the discussion. Hope that sounds good to everyone. And Tristan, why don't you go ahead and take over? Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for joining, and thank you, Laura and Peter, for the introduction. Peter, if we can start the PowerPoint. Yeah, and next slide. So as Laura mentioned, my name is Tristan Cabello. I'm the Associate Director for the Master of Liberal Arts here at Johns Hopkins University, and I'll be the presenter for today's event. Next slide. As Laura mentioned also, we have organized many events for our 60th anniversary. This is part of the micro seminars. This one is going to be a little bit different. We probably going to meet for 40-45 minutes, and I will be speaking for maybe 25-30 minutes, and we'll have some time for a Q&A at the end. Next slide. So why talking about critical race theory in a liberal arts program? Simply because it aligns perfectly with our program's core values and learning outcomes. Critical race theory, indeed, or CRT, indeed examines humanistic questions from an interdisciplinary perspective. It challenges dominant power systems, and it seeks to understand how diversity, equity, and inclusion works. CRT also questions the very nature of knowledge. Before we proceed to the conversation, I just want to clarify something. This presentation is not about the recent developments in Florida, in the Republican Party primaries, or in what's happening in specific schools and libraries in the United States. In fact, I would actually argue it's precisely about the contrary. Because interestingly enough, and you may have noticed that too, currently in the US and in most of Europe, those who discuss critical race theory in the news, on TV, on the radio, are often those who have a very limited knowledge about it. So today, my aim is very simple. It's to explain what CRT is about, so you can form your own opinion. I've tried to summarize critical race theory into 8 key lessons, ranked from the most widely accepted and integrated into our public discourses to those that may still spark some resistance or controversy. And along the way, I'll try to introduce you to the most famous CRT scholars. Next slide. My personal journey with critical race theory began in graduate school, where I took a course on the subject. And so this textbook that you see here was the textbook that was assigned. It's the CRT Bible. And this textbook profoundly shaped my intellectual development and helped me understand, navigate my own identities as I had moved from Europe to the United States. However, I must admit that the dense and highly theoretical prose in this book often required multiple readings before grasping the argument. And even as graduate students in history, sociology, African American studies, LGBT studies, we all struggled in the classroom to understand it. And so this serves as a disclaimer too, right? If we, as graduate students in a prestigious university in the United States, did not understand it clearly, it's very likely that the many people who reference CRT in the news don't fully comprehend it either. So now let's try to delve into 8 simple lessons aiming to demystify what critical race theory is. Let me try to explain in 8 simple, at least I hope so, key points, what I think CRT is about. Next slide. Lesson number 1, race is socially constructed. In critical race theory, it's widely accepted that race is not a biological category. And this is an idea also that's widely accepted in the world. We recognize the power of this idea because it means that there are no inherent qualities tied to a racial group. Race is not a fixed, unchanging identity, but rather a contextual and unstable concept. So when we say that race is socially constructed, we acknowledge that the significance of superficial physical differences is much less important than the social, economic, and political meanings historically assigned to racial categories. Beliefs about race are shaped by ideas about the connections between physical characteristics or geographic origins, for example, and the value attributed to different group of people. Next slide. The insights of Du Bois, probably the first critical race theorist, shed light on this topic in The Soul of White Folks that he published after The Soul of Black Folks. He explores America's racial classification system, and he argues that whiteness is actually a very recent political invention that is linked to and rooted in material inequality in America. And so it's worth then noting that if race is a socially constructed identity, the same holds true for gender, for sexual orientation, and for class. Next slide. Second lesson, racism is a system. Next slide. After the killing of Tyree Nichols, I spoke in the news about systemic racism. To me, that was an example of systemic racism. The fact that 4 African-American police officers are killing this Black man is still very much an event that's linked to systemic racism. Systemic racism is a concept that's widely accepted by race and critical race theory scholars. However, my interviews, or what I said on TV, did spark backlash on social media, and I received a lot of hateful messages questioning my intention. We have an example right here. And there were 3 recurring themes that emerged out of those messages. One, the notion of an us versus them mentality. You see here that person says, "Leave us alone," and she's literally excluding me from the discourse. Two, the false belief that systemic racism is scapegoating white people. For example, she's referring to white people when I'm pretty sure that I never referred to white people in the interview. And three, the labeling of a simple description of a system as hateful and racist. Next slide. So it's clear here that those who responded in this way had little understanding of what critical race theory is about. Critical race theory scholars view racism as pervasive and ingrained in our daily lives. Rather than viewing racism as slowly individual acts, they argue that it operates within structural systems. Structural racism does not diminish the significance of individual acts of racism. Instead, it recognizes how these acts are bolstered by a system that amplifies their impact. Discriminatory actions by police officers, for example, are supported by state power. And for example, discriminatory employers are often faced with minimal legal consequences. Stokely Carmichael, the leader of SNCC, already highlighted the systemic nature of racism in his 1967 book, Black Power. He drew attention to the distinction between individual acts of racism and institutional racism, stating, quote, "When white terrorists bomb a black church and kill 5 children, this is an act of individual racism. But when 500 black babies die each year because of the lack of power, food, shelter, or medical facilities, this is a function of institutional racism." And so the issues that Carmichael addressed in 1967 persist today. The evidence of structural racism is overwhelming. Disparities in health, income, wealth, life expectancy, or occupational status consistently show that white people, on average, fare better than people of color. And so escaping structural racism is nearly impossible. Let me give you an example. I am a professor committed to anti-racism in the classroom. If an exam that I'm grading is racially biased, my accurate grading reinforces racial inequality. People of color are also integral to this discourse as well. Consider a black police officer in New York City who's just simply following orders and implementing, for example, the stop and frisk policy that disproportionately impact Black and Latino men. By carrying out their job diligently, by just doing their job well, they often unknowingly and unconsciously contribute to structural racism. Next slide. Lesson number 3. We need to challenge the myth of progress. Things are not always getting better. Critical race theorists vehemently reject the idea of racial progress as a widespread myth. They argue that the linear narrative of advancement as portrayed in textbook, for example, is far from accurate. The notion that our country moved from slavery to Jim Crow and eventually achieved victories through the civil rights movement is the dominant narrative. However, CRT scholars assert that structural racism in America is never eradicated. Instead, it continuously reinvents itself. Next slide. This viewpoint aligns with the arguments of Derek Bell, one of the founders of critical race theory. Bell contends that racism is an integral, permanent, and indestructible aspect of American life, persistently reemerging through new policies and laws when old methods of oppressions are challenged. 2 examples here. One example, legal segregation does not exist in the US anymore. Yet when we look at any map of any American city, it's obvious that racial segregation still exists, but in a different way. Why is this perspective important? It challenges the deceptive nature, the deceptive narrative of "we've come such a long way," which often obscures the reality that the current situation remains very, very problematic. Narratives of inevitable progress downplay the history of racial oppression hindering our ability to comprehend and confront present-day forms of domination. Next slide. Lesson number 4, critical race theorists assert that racism can manifest itself through seemingly neutral speech and race-neutral policies. And here we're getting to the claims that are often met with skepticism. For example, when you say that, people may object, well, what do you think? Do you think that there are politicians or lawmakers, plotting in their office to make sure that a law disproportionately affect Black people? And my answer to that is yes. Next slide. Let's not dismiss this notion without consideration then. Let's take those 2 advisors to past presidents, both Ronald Reagan and Richard Nixon. They've made revealing statements that shed light on this critical race theory lesson. Let's start with Lee Atwater here, Ronald Reagan's advisor. And those quotes the recordings of those quotes are available on YouTube. You can check them for yourself. He says, "You started in 1954 by saying N-word, N-word, N-word. By 1968, you can't say the N-word anymore. That hurts you, it backfires. So you say stuff like forced busing, states' rights, and all that stuff, and you're getting so abstract. Now you're talking about cutting taxes, and all these things you're talking about are totally economic things, and the byproduct of them is that Blacks get hurt worse than whites. We want to cut this. Is much more abstract than even the busing things, and a hell lot more abstract than the N-word." Another example is a quote by John Herlishman, one of Richard Nixon's advisor. He says, "The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had 2 enemies, the anti-war left and Black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or Black. But by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and Blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did." So through a strategic approach, they associated concepts like states' right, forced busing, taxes, and healthcare with racial subordination. By gradually increasing the level of abstraction, they connected seemingly unrelated ideas to the project of maintaining white dominance and enhancing their relative material position at the expense of Black people. This colorblind strategy allowed for targeting political enemies while at the same time avoiding alienation of white voters who viewed overt racism as taboo. Next slide. I don't have to go into the details here. I don't have time to go onto the details, but sociologist Eduardo Bonilla Silva is among the scholars who have extensively studied this phenomenon. Next slide. Intersectionality is important. Critical theory highlights that the history of progressive social movement is intertwined with various forms of discrimination. Take, for example, the suffragists who fought for women's right to vote, and they are considered heroic by many standards, right? They challenge male dominance. They challenged the patriarchal powers of their time. And they were advocating for women's greater participation in government. But many of them opposed granting the franchise to Black men. Take, for example, Susan B. Anthony. Despite receiving support from Frederick Douglass in her fight, she opposed the voting rights of Black men and declared, quote, this is somebody who called herself a feminist here. "I would cut off my right arm before I would ever work or demand a ballot for a Black man," end quote. Next slide. Early discussions of intersectionality by Kimberly Crenshaw. Kimberly Crenshaw is the scholar, of course, who invented and coined the term. Illustrate that why one-size-fits-all approaches to addressing social problems often fail or further marginalize people of color. Intersectionality acknowledges that we all exist at the crossroads of racial, gender, and class-based structural hierarchies. It emphasizes that true liberation cannot be achieved in a partial or selective manner. For example, when the LGBT movement started the struggle for gay marriage, nobody actually talked about the fact that many gay couples could not even afford buying a marriage license, a wedding license, right? And so this is precisely the reason. This is precisely what Kimberly Crenshaw is saying, is that by actually using the concept of intersectionality, we do understand the multiple forms of oppression that are around us. So while fighting for something that's extremely positive, like feminism, we sometimes avoid talking about other people who are oppressed or oppressed in multiple ways. Next slide, I think, yeah. Lesson number 6, we must create counter-narratives. One of the most misunderstood aspects of critical theory is the emphasis on amplifying the voices of victims. Critical race theory gives serious attention to the stories and experiences of people of color, analyzing discrimination from their perspectives as targets of racism. This approach stands in stark contrast to conventional practice, where racism inherently undermines the opinions, ideas, and emotion of its targets. By centering the experiences of racism's targets, critical race theory challenges the dismissal of claims about the impact of racism. It is important to note that this does not mean that the accounts of people of color are always correct, or that our opinions are uniform. However, on average, people of color possess a deeper understanding of the experiences and the consequences of structural racism. Next slide. Unfortunately, scholarship and policy setting processes often discount the voices of people of color. Richard Delgado here, in his work Imperial Scholar, exposed how the perspectives of people of color were marginalized in the field of civil rights law. He found that a small group of white scholars actually dominated the literature on protecting minority rights in top law reviews. Delgado argued that excluding members of marginalized groups from contributing to the development of laws designed to protect their interests has implications for the effectiveness of those laws. Dominant group members may lack important insights into group norms, may not effectively champion minority interest, and may inadvertently become seen as spokesperson for those groups, making it more challenging for actual group members to advocate for themselves in the future. It's essential to understand that these factors do not imply any malice on the part of those civil rights scholars. Delgado simply recognized that exclusion shapes collective understandings of group priorities and civil rights, just as inclusion does. Next slide. Organizations are always racialized. Race plays a significant role in shaping the formation and longevity of organizations. American workplaces, schools, and churches continue to be highly segregated, reflecting the influence of race as a fundamental social relationship. Discrimination affects job opportunities, workplace hierarchies, interactions among employees, and various other seemingly race-neutral aspects of organization. Now, when you say that, usually the counter-argument is, how can you say that when there is a DEI officer and a DEI plan in almost every company, university, and organizations in the United States? Well, I'm saying that because no matter all the DI plans, racial inequality still persists, and they persist across the ideological spectrum, challenging the notion that liberal organizations are inherently more racially inclusive. Universities, for example, often seen as bastions of liberal progressive thought, still struggle with racial underrepresentation among students and faculty, despite desegregation efforts still the 1960s. Silicon Valley tech giants like Apple and Google, also seen as places of liberal progressive thinking, consistently fall short of their diversity goals, with racial disparities deeply entrenched in their organization hierarchies. Next slide. And surprisingly, even organizations like the Southern Poverty Law Center, originally established to combat white supremacy, have faced criticism for marginalizing the very people of color they aim to support within their internal culture. Sorry. Next slide. Let me conclude by what I think is probably the most provocative aspect of critical race theory: interest convergence. Next slide. In 1988, Derek Bell, one of the founder of critical race theory, published a short story that's entitled Space Traders. And so in that short story, it's 1988. In that short story, you have aliens who are coming to America, and they offer to eliminate America's national debt, to restore the environment, and to provide limitless clean energy in exchange for handing over all legally classified Black individuals. And so in the short story, there is a debate. There's actually a political campaign, and because America has to vote, right? And so it's very surprising because you see white business leaders who are saying, "Oh, we want to keep Black people in America because we are fearing that we're going to lose some profit," but eventually, Americans decide to sacrifice Black lives for white progress. Bell's parable illustrates his theory of interest convergence. And that's not a theory that he invented, of course, which posits that racial equality for Black people will only be accommodated when it aligns with the interests of white people. In this story, when the aliens arrived in America, interests diverge and Black lives are given to the aliens for white progress. And so here, I may sound too positive, too idealistic, but while this story seems highly possible in the late 1980s, I'm not sure it would make sense today. Because in fact, on many fronts, I feel that interest convergence has actually already started. And there are three main reasons, I think, why this convergence has already started. One, the changing demographics in America, where white people will soon be a minority. The country is becoming more diverse. Younger generation view race, gender, and sexuality as more fluid categories, and also understand systems of power and domination. In the past year, I've given a few talks in high schools in New York City about diversity and inclusion, and I'm always very surprised and pleasantly surprised about how the theoretical framework of those 15, 16, 17 years old has been influenced by critical race theory and how they think about systems of power very intelligently and intersectionality in a very elegant way. Second reason, many of the recent crises still disproportionately impact people of color. That is true: economic crisis, health crisis, pandemics. But there is a growing recognition that these disparities are also driven by class, leading to a convergence of interest among working class and middle class individuals, often regardless of race. Who would have thought, for example, just 15 years ago, that a self-proclaimed socialist could even have a slight chance of winning the presidential primary of a major party? Third reason, the 2020 Black Lives Matter movement demonstrated that the fight for racial equality intersects with other issues such as healthcare, climate change, and overall well-being. This movement showcased the interconnectedness of racial justice with various aspects of society, even the connection between environmental justice and racial justice. And this younger generation of activists understands that all these issues are connected, that we cannot get environmental justice if we don't get racial justice first. And so all these factors to me demonstrate that demonstrate the soundness and also the strengths of the argument put forth by critical race theorists. So as a conclusion, critical race theory matters because it unveils the hidden racial biases in seemingly neutral language, because it reveals how organizations distribute resources and shape agency, because it challenges the myth of inevitable racial progress, because it acknowledges the compounding effects of intersecting marginalized categories and forces us to confront the causes and consequences of racism that mainstream discussions intentionally obscure. Next slide. If you want to know more on critical race theory, I recommend two books. The first one here by Victor Ray is an introduction to critical race theory. In the same vein that I presented critical race theory in this presentation, he has a couple of points, very straightforward points that summarizes the main arguments in critical race theory as many more than I have in this presentations. Like I think it's 20 points, 20 arguments, but it's very readable and very easy to understand. On the second book here is probably the most important book on critical race theory, with all the key articles that I've mentioned in this presentation, and with all the key scholars. Disclaimer, it is not easy to understand. This is a hard read, and most of the articles that you will read in this anthology may not make sense after the second, third, fourth reading. So thank you so much for listening. We have, I think, 10 minutes for question discussion, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.